Fetch the water, Elise ordered. She pointed a trembling finger toward the ruined stone well. The man standing behind her was covered in dried mud and enemy blood. He was massive enough to eclipse the harsh midday sun. Elise assumed he was just another desperate vagrant wandering the southern roads. She did not notice the heavy iron sword strapped to his thigh. She did not know he was King Conrad. He was the ruthless sovereign who had just burned the Northern Rebellion to ash. Powerful lords wept openly when his shadow fell across their path. Seasoned generals begged for mercy before he even drew his blade. Now, a starving woman in a patched dress was commanding him to do manual labor. Conrad stared down at the frayed rope resting near his heavy leather boots. A cold, lethal silence descended over the empty yard. He could end her fragile life with a single motion. Instead, the most dangerous man in the known world slowly unbuckled his weapon belt. He dropped the heavy steel into the dry dust. He walked directly to the well and grabbed the heavy wooden bucket. He obeyed her without a single word. Fraddled rope snapped with a sharp crack. Elise watched the heavy wooden bucket plummet into the darkness of the well. A distant splash echoed from the bottom. She dropped to her knees in the dry dirt. Her blistered hands shook as she stared into the black hole. It was the third time the rope had broken this month. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on her aching shoulders. Summer was ending, but the heat refused to break. Winter was only weeks away. Her grain store was nearly empty, and her fields were dying. She had not slept a full night since her father died in the spring. Elise closed her eyes and took a ragged breath. She refused to let the tears fall. Crying wasted water, and water was something she no longer had. A heavy crunch of boots on gravel broke the silence. Elise opened her eyes and slowly turned around. A man stood at the edge of her broken fence. He was completely covered in a thick layer of dust and dried mud. He was massive. His broad shoulders blocked out the harsh sunlight. A heavy iron sword hung loosely at his hip. His dark hair was cut short and clung to his sweaty forehead. He looked exactly like the brutal mercenaries who plagued the southern roads. He was actually Conrad. Conrad had just secured the northern territories through a month of relentless bloodshed. He was a king who ruled through fear and absolute force. He had left his royal guard a mile down the dirt road. He was sick of the cheering, the bowing, and the smell of death. He only wanted an hour of silence. He wanted a drink of clean water. Conrad stepped through the broken gate and walked toward the well. He expected the women to scream or run away. Most people dropped to their knees when a man of his size approached them with a weapon. Elise did not move. She wiped the sweat from her dirty brow and simply stared at him. She did not have the energy left to be afraid. Exhaustion heavily outweighed her sense of self-preservation. "If you are going to stand there, make yourself useful," Elise said. Her voice was hoarse and cracked from severe thirst. Conrad stopped in his tracks. He stared down at the scrawny woman in the patched dress. No one had spoken to him in that tone for 15 years. Men usually begged for mercy before he even drew his sword. He blinked slowly. "Fetch the water," Elise ordered. She pointed a trembling finger at the frayed rope hanging over the stone edge. "The bucket fell, and my hands are done for today." She assumed he was a wandering laborer looking for a barn to sleep in. She assumed he would trade a few minutes of work for a scrap of food. Conrad looked at the ruined well. He looked back down at Elise. Her face was pale, smeared with dirt and hollowed by hunger. Yet, she held her ground and met his cold gaze without flinching. A strange sensation settled deep in Conrad's chest. It was not anger, it was genuine amusement. He slowly reached down and unbuckled his sword belt. The heavy iron weapon hit the dust with a dull thud. Elise flinched slightly, but she refused to step backward. Conrad walked directly to the edge of the well. He did not utter a single word. He knelt by the stone wall and inspected the broken rope. His large hands easily grasped the rough hemp. He leaned over the edge and reached down into the dark shaft. His muscles flexed under his filthy tunic as he grabbed the submerged bucket. He hauled the heavy wood up with one effortless pull. Water sloshed over the rim and soaked his boots. He set the bucket gently at Elise's feet. Elise stared at the clean, rippling water. She looked up at his face. His jaw was sharp and covered in a dark, coarse stubble. His eyes were a pale, piercing gray. "Thank you," she whispered. Conrad simply nodded. He wiped his mud-stained hands on his coarse trousers. He realized suddenly that he did not want to leave this farm. The absolute silence of this ruined place felt better than his crowded throne room. He looked at the small, dilapidated stone cottage behind her. "I need a roof for the night," Conrad said. His voice was deep, rough, and entirely unused to asking for permission. Elise hesitated. She had absolutely nothing of value to offer a stranger. She had half a loaf of stale bread and a barn with a leaking roof. "You can sleep in the hay," she replied cautiously. "In exchange for your labor." Conrad agreed without a second thought. The undisputed ruler of 6 territories bent down and picked up the water bucket. He carried it effortlessly toward her small house. Elise followed close behind him in the dirt. She wondered who this silent giant truly was. Conrad wondered why carrying a wooden bucket felt lighter than wearing a crown. The barn smelled of dry rot and old dust. Conrad sat heavily on a thin layer of hay. He leaned his head back against the drafty wooden wall. Night had fallen completely over the quiet farm. Through the missing shingles in the roof, he could see a few scattered stars. His royal guard was likely tearing the countryside apart looking for him. His generals were probably panicking in their war tents. Conrad did not care. He closed his eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of the crickets. It was first time in months he heard something other than dying men. Morning came with a harsh, biting chill. Frost coated the dying crops in the ruined fields. Conrad woke before the sun fully rose above the tree line. He walked out into the crisp autumn air. Elise was already awake. She stood by the broken fence with an old iron hammer. She was struggling to drive a wooden post into the frozen ground. The hammer was far too heavy for her thin wrists. Conrad watched her fail twice before he stepped forward. He took the tool directly from her hands without asking. He swung the hammer down in one smooth arc. The thick post sank deep into the dirt with a single deafening blow. Elise stepped back and stared at him. "You are good at hitting things," she noted quietly. Conrad simply handed the hammer back to her. He turned toward the large pile of uncut logs near the house. He found an old axe resting against a decaying stump. The steel blade was dull and heavily chipped. Conrad lifted it anyway. He spent the next 3 hours chopping wood in the freezing cold. He fell into a steady, brutal rhythm. His muscles burned in a way that felt entirely different from combat. There was no blood to dodge here. There was no hidden enemy plotting to stab his back in the dark. There was only the wood, the axe, and the sharp air. He split enough firewood to last the entire winter. Elise watched him from the kitchen window. She had never seen a man work with such terrifying efficiency. He moved exactly like a seasoned soldier. She tried to push the unsettling thought away. Wandering farmhands often had dark and violent pasts. She decided his history was none of her business. She only cared that her roof was getting fixed and her water was drawn. By midday, Conrad finished stacking the final log. His dark tunic clung to his chest with sweat. Elise walked out of the house carrying a wooden bowl. Steam rose from the dark liquid inside. "Eat," she said. She handed the bowl to him along with a carved spoon. Conrad looked down at the hot meal. It was a watery broth with a few pale root vegetables and tough bread. It was basic peasant food. His hunting hounds back at the capital ate better meat than this. He looked up and saw Elise holding a much smaller bowl for herself. She had given him the larger portion. "Is this all you have left?" Conrad asked. His deep voice broke the silence like a grinding stone. Elise looked away toward the dead fields. "It will last until the heavy snow comes," she lied. Conrad knew a lie the second he heard one. He had spent his life surrounded by lying diplomats and treacherous lords. He saw the raw hunger hollowed out in her cheeks. He noticed the way her faded dress hung loosely on her thin frame. She was starving. She was giving her last real meal to a stranger she met yesterday. "Take it," Elise insisted when he did not move to eat. "You earned it this morning with the wood." Conrad sat down slowly on the chopping stump. He ate the watery soup in total silence. It tasted like dirt and old salt. It was the best thing he had eaten in years. Elise sat on the porch steps a few feet away. She ate her meager portion methodically. She chewed the stale bread as if trying to make it last forever. Conrad watched her tearfully out of the corner of his eye. He had conquered vast cities and burned rebel fortresses to the ground. He had taken gold from kings and land from powerful lords. None of those people had ever willingly shared their wealth. This broken woman was offering him her lifeblood for chopping wood. "Why are you alone here?" Conrad asked suddenly. Elise paused. Her grip tightened around her wooden spoon. "My father died of the winter fever," she answered. Her tone was flat and heavily practiced. "He owed money to the local magistrate." "And the magistrate?" Conrad prompted. "He takes the harvest," Elise said quietly. "He took our draft horses in the spring." She looked down at her empty bowl with defeated eyes. "He says he will take the land next month if I do not pay the tax." Conrad felt a familiar darkness coil deep in his gut. It was the same cold fury he felt before ordering an execution. A local magistrate was bleeding and starving orphan dry. The crime happened in his own kingdom. It happened right under his own strict laws. He kept his face completely blanked. "Let him try to take it," Conrad said. His voice was dangerously calm. Elise shook her head with a bitter smile. "You do not understand how things work out here." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her skirt. "Men with swords make the rules." She walked back into the small house without another word. Conrad remained seated on the stump. He stared at the empty bowl in his large hands. She was absolutely right. Men with swords did make the rules in this brutal world. Conrad happened to have the biggest sword in the entire realm. He decided he was definitely not leaving the farm tomorrow. He needed to fix the leaking roof first. He also needed to meet this local magistrate. The evening wind picked up and rattled the loose windows. Conrad walked into the small kitchen carrying an armful of fresh firewood. Elise was trying to light a fire in the stone hearth. Her hands were shaking badly from the cold draft. Conrad dropped the wood quietly on the stone floor. He knelt beside her without hesitation. He took the flint gently from her trembling fingers. He struck it once against the steel. A bright spark caught the dry kindling immediately. Warm light flooded the dim, freezing room. Elise let out a long breath of pure relief. She turned to thank him. Her eyes caught the side of his left hand. A deep cut ran across his knuckles. He had slipped with the dull axe earlier in the day. The shallow wound was clotted with dark dirt and dried blood. Conrad completely ignored it. He had survived poisoned arrows and deep spear thrusts. A simple wood-chopping scratch meant nothing to a man like him. Elise frowned and stood up immediately. "Sit in the chair," she commanded. Conrad looked at her in genuine surprise. He was a sovereign who ordered armies across entire continents. No one ever told him where to sit. He slowly lowered himself into the rickety wooden chair. Elise walked to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. She pulled out a clean rag and a small bottle of clear spirit. She poured warm water from an iron kettle into a tin basin. She knelt on the floor directly in front of him. She took his massive, calloused hand in her small ones. Her touch was startlingly gentle. Conrad tensed instinctively. He was not used to anyone touching him with that violent intent. Elise dipped the rag into the warm water. She carefully washed the dirt from his wound. "You should be more careful," she scolded softly. "A bad infection could easily cost you a hand." Conrad stared down at her bowed head. Her brown hair caught the golden light of the growing fire. She poured a few drops of the sharp-smelling spirit onto the cut. It stung sharply. Conrad did not flinch. He watched her tear a strip from the hem of her own apron. She wrapped the clean cloth tightly around his knuckles. She tied it off with a neat, practiced knot. She was using her own extremely limited supplies on him. She had nothing, yet she offered him everything she could. "There," Elise said. She patted his large hand and released it. "Try to keep it clean tomorrow." Conrad looked at the makeshift bandage. It was just a scrap of rough linen. It felt heavier than steel gauntlets. "Why do you care?" Conrad asked. His tone was rougher than he intended. Elise paused while gathering the bloody basin. She looked at him with tired, honest eyes. "The world is hard enough," she said. "We do not need to let each other bleed." She carried the water away to the sink in the dark corner. Conrad sat by the fire for a very long time. He watched the flames dance over the fresh logs he had chopped. The world was indeed hard.
He was usually the one making it that way for everyone else. He looked down at his bandaged hand again. A strange, quiet peace settled over him. He belonged on a blood-soaked throne, yet he felt strangely at home in this ruined kitchen. 3 days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Conrad repaired the leaking roof before the first frost melted. He fixed the broken gate and sharpened the rusted plow. Ilus worked tirelessly beside him in the dying fields. They spoke very little during the daylight hours. Sans felt comfortable and safe between them. Conrad found rare peace in the mundane labor. Chopping wood became a form of quiet meditation. Drawing water from the deep well replaced swinging a heavy sword. He watched Elise mend clothes by the hearth every evening. Her quiet strength fascinated him more than courtly intrigue. She never complained about her aching back. She never cried over her empty pantry. She simply survived with quiet dignity. These small details anchored him to the present moment. He delayed his departure every single morning. Returning to his throne felt less important every day.
His generals could manage the border skirmishes without him. His royal council could argue over taxes in his absence. He preferred the smell of hay and wood smoke. Trouble arrived on the morning of the 4th day. 4 horses trotted heavily down the dirt road. The loud crunch of heavy hooves broke the autumn peace. Elise froze near the well and dropped her wooden bucket. A fat man in a velvet coat rode the lead stallion. He was Magistrate Bartholomew. 3 armed guards rode closely behind his flank. Their iron chainmail clinked sharply in the cold wind. Conrad was inside the barn mending a leather saddle. The sound of halting horses caught his immediate attention. He set the leather down and walked to the barn door. Staying hidden in the shadows allowed him to watch the yard. Bartholomew dismounted with a loud grunt. The magistrate adjusted his expensive coat and sneered at the mud. Bartholomew enjoyed inflicting misery upon the helpless peasants. He spat a glob of phlegm into the clean wire trough. "This farm is an eyesore," the magistrate declared loudly. "I will sell it to the southern merchants by winter." Elise stepped forward to defend her family legacy. "My grandfather built this house with his own hands," she argued. Bartholomew sneered at her defiance. "Dead men hold no claims in my jurisdiction," he replied. "Your grace period is over." His voice carried a sickening, practiced arrogance. "The tax is not due until the harvest moon," Elise countered. She kept her chin raised despite her trembling hands. "The decree changed yesterday," the magistrate lied smoothly. He pulled a rolled parchment from his thick belt. "You owe 50 silver coins by noon today." Elise gripped the rough fabric of her faded apron. 50 silver coins could buy 3 farms outright. "You know I do not have that kind of money," she said. Her voice threatened to break, but she held it steady. Bartholomew smiled a greasy, satisfied smile. "Then you forfeit the land and the house today." He waved the fat hand toward his armed guards. "Take the grain from the cellar as an initial payment." 2 guards dismounted and drew their iron swords. They marched boldly toward the small stone house. Elise rushed forward to block the wooden door. "You cannot take my seed grain," she shouted. She spread her thin arms across the narrow doorframe. "I will starve before midwinter arrives." One guard laughed and shoved her hard by the shoulder. Elise stumbled backward and hit the frozen dirt. She scraped her paws on the sharp, icy gravel. A sudden noise echoed from the dark doorway of the ruined barn. The sound did not come from a wild beast. Conrad stepped out into the harsh autumn sunlight. His face was a mask of pure, lethal fury. He did not bother grabbing his hidden steel sword. Walking across the yard, he moved with predatory speed. The guards stopped and turned toward the incoming threat. They saw a man the size of a mountain charging them. "Kill the vagrant," Bartholomew ordered in penitent squeak. The closest guard swung his heavy iron blade. Conrad stepped inside the wide arc without breaking stride. He grabbed the man's armored wrist with one bare hand. Twisting his iron grip, he applied sudden, brutal force. A loud snap echoed across the silent farm. The guard screamed in agony and dropped his weapon. Conrad drove his heavy knee into the man's armored chest. The injured man collapsed into the dirt and did not move again. The second guard hesitated and took a fast step backward. Fear flashed brightly in his wide, staring eyes. Conrad closed the distance in 2 long strides. He grabbed the second man by his chainmail collar. Lifting the grown soldier off the ground required 0 effort. He threw him like a broken toy against the stone well. The man crumpled to the frozen grass with a heavy thud. Bartholomew scrabbled backward toward his dark horse. His velvet coat caught on the splintered wooden fence. Tearing the expensive fabric, he panicked blindly. Conrad turned his deadly gaze toward the fleeing magistrate. His pale eyes promised inescapable retribution. "Leave," Conrad commanded softly. His voice was a dark rumble that seemed to shake the ground. Bartholomew managed to mount his frightened horse clumsily. "You will hang for this," the magistrate shrieked. Spurring his horse, he galloped away in sheer terror. The conscious guard limped desperately after his fleeing master. The yard fell silent once more. Dust settled slowly over the scattered, bloodless gravel. Conrad stood alone in the center of the ruined gate. His broad chest heaved slightly from the brief exultation. He realized his simple disguise was now permanently ruined. A starving farmhand did not fight like a seasoned warlord. Turning around slowly, he faced Elise. He expected her to scream for him to leave her farm. Waiting for Tara in her dark eyes felt agonizing. Elise sat in the dirt and stared at the fallen swords. She looked up at his hardened, unreadable face. Running away was not in her nature. She pushed herself up from the frozen ground. Dusting off her skirt, she ignored her scraped hands. "You broke his arm," she stated plainly. Conrad nodded once, his expression stoic. "He touched you," Conrad replied. The justification felt sufficient and final to him. Elise walked cautiously closer to his towering frame. She reached out and lightly touched his rigid forearm. Her gentle touch calmed the violent storm raging in his blood. "They will come back with the town militia," she warned softly. Conrad looked down at her dirt-smudged face. "Let them come," he said calmly. Silently, he promised to burn the entire town to ash if they returned. No one would ever threaten this fragile woman again. He walked over and picked up the heavy dropped swords. Tossing the weapons easily over the broken fence ended the confrontation. Elise watched his broad back move with lethal grace. She knew this silent man was incredibly dangerous. Sensing his dark and violent past did not bother her. She had never felt safer in her harsh life. Conrad expected her to demand more answers. Normal citizens fled from his cold, violent nature. Elise simply looked at his bare knuckles. "You tore your bandage," she observed quietly. The simple statement caught him off guard. He looked down at his dirty left hand. The linen strip was ruined from hitting the armored chest. "I will fetch more water," Elise told him. She picked up her fallen bucket from the dirt. She walked toward the well without looking back. Conrad stood frozen in the middle of the yard. This frail woman possessed a spirit made of iron. He decided he would never let anyone break it. The afternoon sky turned a bruised purple. Cold wind swept through the valley and rattled the loose shutters. Elise paced the small kitchen in a state of quiet panic. She pulled an old canvas sack from beneath her narrow bed. She began packing her few remaining possessions. She folded her mother's wool shawl and placed it at the bottom. She added 3 small wooden bowls and a rusted iron knife. She unlatched the heavy wooden shutters and barred them from the inside. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like approaching boots. She had hidden a small pouch of silver under a loose stone in the hearth. She dug it out and tied it securely around her waist. It was not enough to buy passage on a ship, but it would buy bread. She looked at the small wooden table where her father used to sit. Leaving this house meant erasing her family from the earth. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her wrist. She refused to die for a piece of dirt, no matter how much she loved it. She walked to the door and looked out into the yard. Conrad was not packing. He was calmly sharpening an old scythe on a round grinding stone. The scythe in his hands was an old, rusted farm tool. In his grip, it looked like a lethal weapon of war. He moved the grinding stone with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Sparks flew into the darkening air and died on the damp grass. He looked perfectly relaxed. Elise stepped off the porch and walked toward him. "We need to leave before nightfall," she said. Conrad paused his work and looked up at her worried face. "We are not leaving," he replied evenly. He tested the sharp edge of the blade with his thumb. "They have 30 men in the town guard," Elise argued. She gripped the strap of her canvas sack tightly. "They carry crossbows and heavy pikes." Conrad simply went back to sharpening the farming tool. 30 men is a very small problem, he stated. His utter lack of fear confused her. He was just one man against an entire town. She did not know he had slaughtered hundreds in a single afternoon. "I will not let you die for my land," Elise told him. Conrad stopped the wheel and stood up from the wooden bench. He walked slowly toward her until he cast a long shadow over her face. "No one is going to die tonight," Conrad promised. His voice carried a heavy, undeniable authority. "Go back inside and start a fire." He turned and walked toward the dark edge of the pine forest. Elise watched him disappear into the thick trees. She wanted to run down the road and hide in the hills. Instead, she turned around and walked back into her house. She trusted him more than she trusted her own instincts. The sun dipped completely below the horizon. Conrad moved silently through the dense woods. The forest was pitch black beneath the heavy pine branches. He did not need a lantern to find his way. His eyes adjusted quickly to the cold moonlight filtering through the needles. He tracked game the same way he tracked fleeing rebel lords. He moved without snapping a single twig under his boots. He smelled the damp earth and the sharp scent of pine resin. He found a large deer grazing near a patch of frozen moss. He did not use a bow. He threw his heavy hunting dagger with terrifying speed. The blade struck true, and the animal fell without a sound. It was a clean, merciful kill. An hour later, he returned to the small stone cottage. He carried the heavy deer over his broad shoulders as if it weighed nothing at all. He dropped the carcass on the wooden porch with a solid thud. Blood soaked into his tunic, but he ignored the damp cold. Elise opened the door and gasped. She had not seen fresh meat in almost a year. Conrad pulled his hunting knife from his boot and knelt beside the animal. "Bring a basin," he ordered quietly. They spent the next 2 hours butchering the meat in the cold air. Conrad worked with fast, precise cuts. He separated the meat from the bone with ruthless efficiency. Elise carried buckets of clean water from the well to wash the cuts. Her hands were covered in blood, but she did not flinch. She rubbed the fresh meat with coarse salt and dried herbs. They hung the largest pieces from the wooden rafters to dry. The immediate threat of starvation vanished in a matter of hours. The small house soon smelled of roasting venison and wood smoke. They sat together on the floor in front of the stone fireplace. The fire crackled loudly and cast long shadows against the stone walls. Elise handed him a wooden plate piled high with roasted meat. She served herself a generous portion as well. They ate in a comfortable, starving silence. Conrad ate his second portion quickly. He watched Elise savor every single bite of the hot meal. She chewed slowly, closing her eyes as the warmth hit her empty stomach. The rich food brought sudden color back into her pale cheeks. He felt a strange tightness in his chest watching her. It was a protective instinct he had never felt for his kingdom. His kingdom was a map of borders and tax ledgers. This woman was a living, breathing person who had shown him mercy. "You are not a farmhand," Elise said quietly. It was not a question. Conrad swallowed his food and stared into the orange flames. He did not want to lie to her anymore. He also did not want to see terror replace the warmth in her eyes. "I was a soldier," Conrad admitted slowly. "I fought in the northern campaigns for a very long time." Elise watched the firelight dance across his hardened face. She saw the countless small scars scattered across his jaw and neck. "Did you desert the army?" she asked. Deserters were hanged immediately in this territory. Conrad almost smiled at the dark irony. He was the one who signed the execution orders for deserters. "I walked away," he answered tearfully. "I needed to remember what quiet sounded like." Elise nodded in quiet understanding. She set her empty plate on the stone hearth. "The things you did in the war," she started cautiously. "Do they keep you awake at night?" Conrad looked directly into her dark, serious eyes. "I did what was necessary to survive," he said. "I killed men who would have gladly killed me." He waited for her to judge him. He waited for the inevitable moral rejection. Elise reached across the small space between them. She rested her hand gently on his knee. "The war is far away from here," she told him softly. "You do not have to fight anymore." Her simple forgiveness struck him harder than a physical blow. She saw a violent killer and offered him absolute peace. Conrad covered her small hand with his large one. Her skin was rough from labor, but her touch was incredibly warm. He wanted to pull her close and shield her from the harsh world. He knew he had to secure the perimeter first. "Get some sleep," Conrad instructed gently. He released her hand and stood up from the floor. "I will keep watch outside." Elise stood up and gathered the wooden plates. She knew arguing with him was completely useless. "Wake me if you hear riders," she said. Conrad nodded and walked out into the freezing night. The temperature had dropped significantly. Frost crunched loudly under his heavy leather boots. He walked past the broken gate and stood in the middle of the dirt road. The dark trees loomed like silent sentinels along the path. He found the crossroads where an old stone marker stood. He reached inside the thick leather pouch tied to his belt. He pulled out a heavy coin forged from black iron. The royal crest of the sovereign king was stamped heavily on both sides. It was the mark of his elite shadow guard. He knelt in the dirt and placed the flat side of his dagger against the heavy coin. He drove the iron marker deep into the cracked wood with one powerful strike. His men were already searching the region for him. The shadow guard tracked these specific markers across enemy lines. They would find the coin before dawn. They would bring the full wrath of the royal army down upon the town. Conrad turned around and walked back to the stone cottage. He sat on the wooden porch and rested his heavy sword across his knees. He pulled a whetstone from his pocket and began to sharpen the steel. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the quiet farmyard. He was ready for war. The night passed in heavy, quiet hours. Conrad sat perfectly still on the top step of the porch. He rested his iron sword directly across his knees. The cold wind bit hard through his simple linen tunic. He ignored the freezing temperature completely. His senses extended far beyond the broken wooden fence. He listened carefully to the rustling of dry leaves in the distant woods. He mapped the dark terrain thoroughly in his mind. A tactical defense required knowing every single blind spot. He knew exactly where the town militia would emerge. Inside the cottage, Elise tossed and turned in her narrow bed. Sleep refused to come to her exhausted mind. She listened to the steady, calm breathing of the large man outside. His presence acted as a heavy, grounding anchor in the storm. She had spent her entire life running from cruel men in power. Now she was trusting her life to a stranger with a dark past. She rose from her bed before the sun broke the horizon. She wrapped her mother's faded wool shawl tightly around her shoulders. She walked into the small kitchen and stoked the dying fire. The small orange flames provided a brief illusion of safety. She found an old, rusted pitchfork leaning against the back door. The wooden handle was splintered and rough against her palms. She gripped the tool tightly anyway. She would absolutely not let Conrad face the mob alone. Outside, the Yishidan sky slowly turned to pale, bruised purple. The quiet morning shattered suddenly. A loud crunch of marching boots echoed heavily down the dirt road. Bright torches flared through the thick pine branches. The town militia marched forward in a disorganized column. Bartholomew rode at the front on a tall black horse. He wore a thick fur cloak to fight the autumn chill. His face was flushed with anger and petty triumph. 30 armed men followed closely behind him. They carried loaded crossbows, heavy iron pikes, and rusted swords. They were not professional soldiers by any means. They were terrified farmers and bakers bullied into uniform by a corrupt official. Conrad stood up slowly from the wooden porch steps. He walked out into the center of the frosted yard. He held his sword casually in his right hand. The heavy steel blade rested effortlessly against his broad shoulder. He looked like a man waiting for a simple conversation. Bartholomew halted his horse sharply at the property line. He sneered down at the lone figure standing in the dirt. "I told you I would return," the magistrate shouted. His voice cracked slightly in the freezing air. "You made a grave mistake striking my guard." Conrad said absolutely nothing. He simply stared upward at the fat man on the horse. His silence unnerved the militiamen standing in the front row. A man facing 30 armed guards should be begging on his knees. Conrad did not even look moderately worried. The heavy wooden door of the cottage creaked open behind him. Elise stepped out onto the cold porch. She walked bravely down the steps and stood at Conrad's side. She raised the rusted pitchfork steadily in front of her. Conrad frowned deeply and looked down at her. "This is not your fight, Elise," he told her quietly. "It is my farm," she replied firmly. She refused to take her eyes off the armed mob. "I will not let them kill you for helping me." Conrad felt a sudden fierce warmth bloom in his chest. She had nothing left in the world, yet she still offered him protection. Bartholomew laughed loudly at the sight. "The vagrant and the orphan," he mocked, a truly pathetic display. He raised a thick, gloved hand high into the air. "Burn the house down to the foundation." He pointed at Elise with a cruel, twisting smile. "Take the woman alive for the labor camps." He looked directly back at Conrad. Put 3 iron arrows in his chest. 10 militiamen stepped forward and raised their heavy crossbows. They leveled the deadly weapons squarely at Conrad. Elise immediately stepped in front of him to block the shots. Conrad gently pushed her behind his broad shoulders. He raised his iron sword and pointed it at the magistrate. "Leave my land now," Conrad commanded. His deep voice carried easily over the rising wind. "If you stay, you will not leave alive." The militiamen hesitated for a fraction of a second. The sheer, undeniable authority in his voice confused them. Bartholomew grew furious at their sudden hesitation. "Shoot him!" the magistrate screamed. Before a single trigger could be pulled, a horn blasted. The sound was ancient, deep, and terrifying. It tore through the quiet valley like thunder. The militiamen froze and looked toward the dark woods in panic. 50 shadows detached rapidly from the tree line. Riders on massive armored warhorses emerged into the morning light. They wore heavy black cloaks over blackened steel armor. Their faces were hidden entirely behind dark iron helms. They moved with lethal, synchronized precision. They did not shout or charge blindly into the yard. They simply surrounded the militia in complete, terrifying silence. The Royal Shadow Guard had finally answered the coin. Panic swept through the town guard instantly. These were the most feared warriors in the entire known world. One terrified militiaman dropped his crossbow in sheer shock. The weapon fired an arrow harmlessly into the frozen dirt. That single sound broke the mob's fragile courage permanently. Weapons clattered to the ground in rapid succession. 30 men surrendered without swinging a single sword. They fell to their knees in the frosted grass. Bartholomew stared at the black riders in absolute horror. He recognized the royal silver wolves stamped on their heavy shields. He could not comprehend why the king's personal guard was at a ruined farm. The towering commander of the Shadow Guard rode forward. He dismounted his warhorse with smooth, predatory grace. He walked past the groveling magistrate without a single glance. He stopped exactly 5 paces from Conrad. The deadly soldier dropped to one knee in the mud. He bowed his helmeted head deeply. "My king," the commander announced clearly. "We await your command." The title hit the quiet yard like a physical blow. Bartholomew stopped breathing entirely. His fat hands gripped the leather reins of his horse in blind panic. The magistrate slid sideways off his saddle and hit the ground hard. He scrambled into the dirt and pressed his face against the mud. The man he had ordered killed was the sovereign ruler. He had just committed high treason in front of the royal guard. Elise dropped her pitchfork immediately. The wood clattered loudly against the stone path. She took a slow, trembling step backward. She stared upward at the massive man standing in front of her. He was not a deserter or a wandering laborer. He was King Conrad the Conqueror. He was the brutal man who burned the Southern Rebellion to ash. Conrad turned around to face her. He saw the raw shock widening her dark eyes. He hated the sudden distance growing between them. He lowered his sword immediately. "Elise," he said softly. He did not want her to kneel in the dirt like the others. Elise stared blankly at the bloody bandage on his hand. She had scolded a powerful king for slipping with an axe. She had ordered the most dangerous man in the world to fetch her water. She could not form a single coherent word. Conrad turned his heavy gaze back to the magistrate. The gentle warmth in his eyes vanished entirely. He became the cold, ruthless sovereign once more. He walked slowly toward the Gravelly official. Bartholomew sobbed loudly into the freezing mud. "Mercy, your grace," he begged desperately. "I did not know who you were." Conrad stopped and looked down at the pathetic man. "You did not know my title," Conrad agreed in a deadly whisper. "But you knew she was hungry." He pointed his heavy sword at Elise. "You knew she was defenseless." He stepped much closer to the terrified official. "You abused your power to crush the weak." Conrad raised his iron sword high into the cold air. "That ends today." The Shadow Guard drew their blades in flawless unison. The metallic scrape echoed sharply across the ruined farm. The reckoning had officially begun. Conrad lowered his sword. He decided against a swift execution. Death offered too quick a release for a man completely corrupted by greed. He signaled his commander with a sharp nod. 2 soldiers stepped forward immediately. They grabbed Bartholomew by the arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. The magistrate sobbed in unabashed terror. Conrad felt absolutely nothing for the trembling man. "You used my laws to bleed innocent people," Conrad stated. His voice carried the cold weight of absolute authority. "You threatened to send a starving woman to the labor camps." He stepped closer to the ruined official. "You will now experience the exact misery you created." Conrad turned to his guard commander. "Strip his rank and seize his property. Take his velvet coat and his horse. Send him to the northern salt mines. He will work until his hands bleed." Bartholomew screamed as the guards dragged him away. The sound of his panic faded into the dark pine forest. Conrad turned his attention to the kneeling militiamen. They pressed their foreheads against the frozen dirt. "Drop your weapons," Conrad ordered. 30 men immediately abandoned their crossbows and rusted swords. The iron weapons formed a messy pile on the frost. "Return to your homes," he told them. "Tell the town that the crown has claimed this land." The men scrambled to their feet and ran desperately down the dirt road. They did not look back. Silence returned to the ruined farmyard. The Shadow Guard remained mounted on their heavy war horses. They awaited their next command in perfect discipline. Conrad looked at his commander. "Set a perimeter in the trees," Conrad said. "No one crosses the fence without my permission." The commander bowed his helmeted head. The black riders turned their horses and vanished quietly into the woods. Conrad was finally alone with Elise. He turned around to face the porch. Elise still stood near the wooden door. Her hands gripped the worn fabric of her apron. She looked incredibly small against the sudden shift in reality. The man who chopped her firewood had just condemned a magistrate to slavery. Conrad took a slow step forward. Elise instinctively took a step backward. The small movement felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. He hated the fear shining in her dark eyes. She turned around and retreated into the small cottage. She left the front door open. Conrad followed her inside. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller than it had this morning. Elise stood by the stone hearth. She aggressively rearranged the clean wooden bowls on the small table. Her hands shook badly. She was trying desperately to maintain some illusion of normalcy. She did not know how to speak to a king. She did not know if she should bow or offer him a chair. Conrad stopped in the center of the room. He reached down and unbuckled his sword belt. The heavy weapon hit the stone floor with a loud clatter. Elise flinched at the sharp noise. She stopped moving the bowls. She kept her eyes firmly fixed on the wooden table. "Elise," Conrad said softly. She refused to look up. "Your Grace," she whispered. The formal title sounded terrible coming from her lips. It created an invisible, impenetrable wall between them. Conrad walked across the room and stood directly across the table from her. "Do not call me that," he instructed quietly. "I am a peasant," Elise argued to the table. "I ordered the king to fetch water from a broken well." She gripped the edge of the wood until her knuckles turned white. "I made you sleep in a rotting barn." Conrad reached across the table. He placed his large hand gently over hers. His rough skin felt warm against her freezing fingers. Elise finally looked up. "You gave me half of your food when you were starving," Conrad reminded her. "You washed my wound when you had nothing to spare." He stepped around the small table. He stood close enough for her to feel the feud radiating from his chest. "My generals bow to my crown," Conrad said. "They smile at me while plotting to steal my gold." He looked deeply into her frightened eyes. "You gave me your bread because you thought I was hungry." He reached up and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You are the only honest thing I have found in 10 years. Elise felt the tension slowly draining from her tense shoulders. The towering warlord was gone. The quiet man who fixed her fence was standing right here. "You lied to me," Elise pointed out. Her voice lacked any real anger. "I omitted the scale of my violence," Conrad corrected gently. "I told you I was a soldier." Elise let out a shaky breath. "A king is just a soldier with a larger army," she whispered. Conrad nodded slowly. "My life is surrounded by malevolent men and endless war," he admitted. "I stepped onto this farm to escape the blood." He looked around the modest, ruined kitchen. "I found peace in this house." Elise looked down at his ruined linen bandage. Blood had soaked completely through the rough fabric. She realized he had blocked the crossbows with his own body. He had prioritized her life over his kingdom. "Sit down," Elise commanded softly. Conrad blinked in surprise. He obeyed without a single word of protest. He lowered his heavy frame into the rickety wooden chair. Elise walked over to the small wooden chest. She retrieved a fresh strip of clean linen and the bottle of spirit. She knelt on the stone floor in front of him. She took his large hand in hers. The royal guards were waiting in the freezing woods outside. The sovereign ruler of 6 territories sat quietly in a peasant kitchen. He watched a starving orphan wash his scraped knuckles. Elise poured the sharp spirit over the fresh cut. She wrapped the clean cloth expertly around his hand. "The world is still hard," Elise told him quietly. "But you do not have to fight alone anymore." Conrad felt a profound, heavy weight lift from his dark soul. He realized he had conquered half the known world looking for a home. He had finally found it in a broken farm on the edge of the woods. Conrad looked at the neat knot she tied. "We need to discuss the winter," Conrad said. He did not move his hand away from her warm touch. "The cold will freeze the soil within a week." Elise stood up and carried the basin to the sink. "The harvest is gone," she admitted. "We have the deer you killed, but it will not last until spring." Conrad watched her wipe down the wooden table. "You will not go hungry ever again," he promised. His tone left absolutely no room for debate. "I have supply wagons moving through the southern pass." He stood up and walked toward the small window. He looked out at the dark tree line where his men waited. "I will redirect a convoy to this valley." Elise paused her cleaning. She stared at his broad back. "You cannot bring the royal court to a ruined farm," she said. "My generals can manage the capital," Conrad replied. He turned around and leaned against the stone wall. "I am staying here." Elise felt her heart skip a heavy beat. "You are a king," she reminded him. "You have a throne to defend." Conrad crossed his heavy arms over his chest. "My throne is made of cold iron and dead men," he stated bitterly. "It holds zero appeal to me." He walked back toward her. "I would rather chop your firewood." Elise did not know how to respond to such a massive confession. A sovereign ruler was abandoning his palace for her. She walked past him to check the roasting meat over the fire. She needed a moment to process the overwhelming reality. Conrad gave her the space she required. He understood that trust was earned slowly. He had terrified her with his true identity today. He would spend the rest of the winter proving he was still the same man. He stepped out onto the back porch to fetch more firewood. The wind howled through the dark pines. The shadow guard remained completely invisible in the trees. Conrad picked up the heavy iron axe from the chopping block. He swung it down and split a thick log perfectly in half. The loud crack echoed across the silent property. He was a conqueror who had destroyed entire nations. He was now entirely focused on keeping one fragile woman warm. He gathered the freshly cut wood into his large arms. He carried the heavy load back into the warm kitchen. Elise was waiting by the hearth. She took a piece of wood from his arms and tossed it into the flames. The fire flared brightly and illuminated her tired face. Conrad stood silently beside her. He watched the flames consume the dry bark. The brutal warlord had finally found his true sanctuary. He would burn the entire world to ash before he let anyone take it away. The first snow of winter fell silently over the valley. Thick white drifts buried the dying fields and covered the frozen dirt road. The harsh weather usually brought a deep, hollow dread to Elise. This year felt entirely different. She stood by the glass window and watched the falling flakes. Conrad was outside in the freezing storm. He wore his simple linen tunic despite the severe drop in temperature. He swung his iron hammer against the barn's wooden frame. He was reinforcing the old walls to withstand the heavy winter snow. He worked for hours without taking a single break. Elise turned away from the window and walked to the stone hearth. She stirred a thick stew of roasted venison and dried roots. The small kitchen was incredibly warm. Conrad had built a blazing fire long before dawn. He made sure she never woke up to a freezing room. His silent devotion moved her more than any spoken promise ever could. She set a clean wooden spoon on the table. A loud knock suddenly rattled the heavy front door. The sound was sharp, heavy, and extremely demanding. It did not sound like Conrad returning from the snowy yard. Elise wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the entryway. She unbarred the heavy wooden door cautiously. A tall man stood on the frosty porch. He wore an immaculate uniform of dark wool and polished iron. A heavy fur cloak draped elegantly over his broad shoulders. His face was sharp, clean-shaven, and utterly arrogant. He was General Vance. He commanded the southern armies for the sovereign crown. Vance stared down at Elise with obvious disgust. He pushed past her without waiting for an invitation. He walked directly into the warm kitchen. His heavy iron boots tracked dirty snow across her clean stone floor. Elise closed the door against the freezing wind. She followed the intruder back into the kitchen. "Where is he?" Vance demanded loudly. He refused to look directly at her. He treated her exactly like a piece of broken furniture. "He is working," Elise replied evenly. Vance scoffed and unclasped his heavy winter cloak. He threw the wet fur carelessly over the clean dining table. "Tell him his general requires an immediate audience," Vance ordered. Elise looked at the wet cloak ruining her clean table. She did not move toward the back door. She stood her ground by the roaring fire. "You can wait for him to finish his task," she stated simply. Vance finally turned his head to look at her properly. His eyes narrowed in cold, calculating anger. He was accustomed to absolute obedience from common peasants. He reached into his tailored coat and pulled out a heavy velvet pouch. He tossed it onto the wooden table with a loud clink. Gold coins spilled out across the scarred wood. "Take this and leave the property immediately," Vance commanded. Elise stared at the glittering gold. She had never seen so much wealth in her entire life. "The king's delusion ends today," the general continued harshly. "He is a sovereign ruler, not a dirt-farming peasant." Vance pointed a gloved finger at the kitchen door. "I will not let a starving orphan distract him from the impending border war." Elise felt a familiar sting of humiliation burn her cheeks. She was just a poor farmer to men like this. She was merely an obstacle to be removed with loose change. She reached out and picked up the heavy velvet pouch. She scooped the scattered coins back inside. Vance smiled a cruel, satisfied smile. He assumed she was taking the easy bribe. The heavy back door swung open with a violent crash. The sound made the general jump backward in sudden alarm. Conrad stepped into the kitchen. He carried a massive load of freshly chopped firewood. His broad shoulders were covered in thick white snow. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. He had heard every single word spoken in his kitchen. He dropped the heavy wood onto the stone floor. The logs clattered loudly and shook the entire room. Vance immediately dropped to one knee. "My king," the general said formally, "we have urgent matters at the southern border." Conrad ignored the military report completely. He walked slowly toward the dining table. He stared down at his general kneeling on the floor. "You tracked Snow into her kitchen," Conrad said. His deep voice was dangerously quiet. Vance looked up in genuine confusion. He expected serious questions about troop movements and supply lines. He did not expect a reprimand about domestic cleanliness. "Your Grace, the rebellion is mobilizing," Vance tried to explain. Conrad reached out and picked up the general's wet cloak. He dropped it onto the floor directly in front of the hearth. "You threw your wet clothes on her clean table," Conrad continued. He stepped much closer to the kneeling man. The sheer physical presence of the king suffocated the small room. Vance swallowed hard and lowered his head again. Conrad looked at the velvet pouch resting in Elisa's hand. "You offered her gold to abandon her own home," Conrad stated. The cold anger in his tone made the blazing fire feel like ice. Vance realized his terrible miscalculation immediately. He had deeply underestimated the king's attachment to this woman. "She is a peasant, Your Grace," Vance defended nervously. "She does not belong in matters of state." Conrad drew his heavy iron sword in one smooth motion. The metallic scrape silenced the room instantly. He rested the sharp tip of the blade against Glance's throat. The general froze completely in sheer terror. A single drop of sweat rolled down Vance's temple. "She is the only reason I did not burn this entire territory to the ground," Conrad whispered. He pressed the cold steel slightly harder against the soft skin. "She fed me when I had absolutely nothing." Conrad looked down at his terrified commander. "She holds more authority in this room than you hold in your entire army." Vance closed his eyes and braced for death. He knew Conrad executed men for much lesser offenses. Elise stepped forward calmly. She did not tremble or shrink away from the drawn weapon. She walked directly to the table and grabbed the velvet pouch. She tossed the bag of gold hard against the general's armored chest. The heavy coins hit his iron breastplate with a dull thud. "Keep your money," Elise said firmly. She looked down at the kneeling man with quiet dignity. "I do not sell my home to rude guests." Conrad watched her with fierce, silent pride. She did not need him to fight this battle for her. He was finding her own unshakable strength. Conrad slowly pulled his sword away from Vance's neck. He sheathed the weapon with a sharp, final click. "Pick up the gold," Conrad ordered his general. Vance scrabbled to gavel the heavy pouch from the floor. His hands shook violently as he stood up. "Now clean the floor," Conrad commanded. Vance stared at his sovereign in utter disbelief. "Your Grace," he asked weakly. "You brought Snow into her house," Conrad repeated. He pointed at the dirty puddles melting on the stone. "You will wipe the floor until she says it is spotless." The general commanding 5,000 men slowly grabbed a rag from the sink. He knelt on the hard stone and began wiping away the dirty water. Humiliation burned brightly on his aristocratic face. Conrad turned his back on the general completely. He walked over to Elise. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Did he frighten you?" Conrad asked softly. He completely ignored the man scrubbing the floor behind him. Elise looked up into his pale, steady eyes. She shook her head slowly. "No," she answered honestly. She realized she was no longer afraid of men with swords. The most dangerous man in the world was standing right beside her. "Good," Conrad said quietly. He brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "The royal supply wagons arrive tomorrow at dawn." He looked around the small, modest kitchen. "We need to clear the barn for the winter grain." Elise smiled a small, genuine smile. "You still need to finish fixing the wall first," she reminded him. Conrad nodded in serious agreement. He treated the chore with the same gravity as a high war council. He turned around and looked at Vance. The general was finishing the last muddy puddle on the floor. "When you are done, wait outside on the porch," Conrad ordered sharply. "The shadow guard will give you an iron axe." Vance stopped scrubbing and looked up in confusion. "An axe, Your Grace?" "Yes," Conrad replied coldly. "You are going to help me chop firewood until sunset." Vance swallowed his pride and bowed his head low. Yes, my king. Conrad looked back at Elise. His cold eyes softened instantly when they met hers. He did not care about the rebellion or the border war today. He only cared about keeping her warm through the brutal winter. He walked back out into the freezing snowstorm. He picked up his heavy hammer and resumed his work on the barn. General Vance spent the entire afternoon swinging an axe in the bitter cold. His tailored uniform was quickly ruined by sweat and flying wood chips. His hands blistered horribly beneath his expensive leather gloves. Conrad worked silently beside him. The king swung his own axe with terrifying, tireless power. He did not offer the general a single word of encouragement. The shadow guard watched from the dark tree line. They remained perfectly still, like statues forged from black iron. They found genuine amusement in watching the arrogant general suffer. Elise watched the men from the kitchen window. She felt a profound sense of safety settle deep in her bones. The power dynamic of her entire world had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer a victim waiting for the next tragedy to strike. She was under the absolute protection of a sovereign king. She turned away from the window and went back to her cooking. She prepared 3 extra bowls for the evening meal. She knew working in the heavy snow required serious sustenance. She even prepared a small bowl for the miserable general. She refused to let her heart turn as cold as the men who ruled the world. Her capacity for kindness remained completely unbroken. She set the table and waited quietly for the men to return. The winter storm raged violently outside the thick stone walls. Inside the small cottage, the fire burned bright and incredibly warm. The terrifying king had finally found his true home. Elise had finally found her family. Dawn broke through the heavy gray clouds with a pale light. The winter snowstorm had finally stopped during the long night. A loud rumble of heavy wooden wheels shook the frozen ground. Elise stepped onto the porch and pulled her thin shawl tight against the biting chill. 20 massive supply wagons rolled slowly down the dirt road. The royal crest was painted boldly on their thick wooden sides. Draft horses stomped heavily in the deep white snow. The shadow guard rode in perfect formation alongside the massive convoy. Conrad walked out of the barn, wiping dirt from his rough hands. He did not look surprised by the enormous display of sudden wealth. He merely nodded to his commander to open the broken gates. The first wagon pulled directly into the ruined yard. Servants in warm wool coats immediately jumped down from the wooden back. They carried heavy iron lag boxes and thick wooden crates toward the small house. Elise watched in stunned silence as they flooded her tiny property. She had never seen so much food in one place. There were large sacks of milled white flour and dried winter fruits. There were heavy barrels of salted meats and sweet dark wine. The looming threat of winter starvation evaporated into the cold morning air. A tall woman in a severe gray dress stepped off the second wagon. She was the head housekeeper of the royal palace. She looked around the broken fence and the small stone cottage. Her face showed clear, uncontrolled shock at the ruined state of the farm. She looked at Elise standing on the porch in a faded, patched dress. The housekeeper frowned deeply at the peasant woman. She did not understand why the royal court had mobilized for this barren place. She walked briskly toward Conrad and bowed low in the snow. "My king, where should we set up your quarters?" she asked. Conrad looked directly at the stern housekeeper. He pointed his large hand toward Elise standing on the wooden steps. "You report to her now," Conrad instructed coldly. "She owns this land and she commands this household." The housekeeper blinked in obvious confusion. She looked back and forth between the sovereign ruler and the orphan. "You will treat her with the exact same respect you give me," Conrad added. His deep voice carried a dangerous, unmistakable warning. "If anyone disrespects her, they will walk back to the capital entirely barefoot." The housekeeper paled immediately and bowed her head low. She turned to Elise and dropped into a deep, formal curtsy. "How may we serve you, madam?" the servant asked respectfully. Elise gripped the wooden railing of the cold porch. She was overwhelmed by the sudden shift in reality. She looked at Conrad for guidance. Conrad offered her a rare, encouraging smile. He wanted her to wield the power he had freely given her. "Take the grain to the barn," Elise managed to say quietly. "Put the heavy blankets inside the house." The servants sprang into action with terrifying speed. They unloaded thick furs, wool blankets, and heavy iron pots. They carried crates of fresh apples and root vegetables into the dry cellar. Elise watched her empty pantry fill to the wooden brim. A young servant girl approached Elise, holding a folded pile of fabric. The material was a deep, rich blue wool, lined with soft winter fur. It was a dress tailored for a noblewoman facing the harsh winter. "For you, madam," the girl whispered timidly. Elise reached out and touched the incredibly soft wool. She had worn the same itchy, thin linen dress for 3 desperate years. She walked slowly into her bedroom to change her old clothes. The heavy wool dress fit her thin frame perfectly. The thick fur collar trapped the heat against her pale neck. She looked in the small, cracked mirror hanging on the stone wall. She no longer looked like a starving peasant waiting to freeze. She looked remarkably like a woman who belonged beside a king. Elise walked back into the bustling kitchen. The servants had already cleaned the stone hearth and lit a massive fire. Conrad was standing near the back door, watching the workers. He saw Elise walk into the warm room. The busy conversation in the kitchen died instantly. Conrad could not take his pale eyes off her. The rich blue fabric brought a healthy color to her cheeks. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He ignored the many servants watching them carefully from the corners. He gently took her small hands in his large ones. Her fingers were finally warm. "You look beautiful," Conrad said sincerely. Elise felt a deep flush rise in her face. "It is too much," she whispered, looking at the overflowing crates. "I do not need all of this." Conrad shook his head slowly. "You need a warm house," he told her firmly. "You need food that does not taste like old salt." He rubbed his thumb gently across her knuckles. "You will never have to scrape at the bottom of a barrel again." Elise leaned softly into his touch. She allowed herself to fully accept the heavy protection he offered. General Vance walked into the kitchen carrying a leather map tube. He looked exhausted from his forced labor the previous day. His hands were heavily bandaged in white linen. He kept his eyes firmly fixed on the stone floor. "The perimeter is secure, my king," Vance reported quietly. "The War Council awaits your return to the capital." Conrad did not look away from Elise. "I am not returning to the capital," Conrad stated flatly. Vance looked up in genuine shock. "The Southern Rebellion is moving north," the general urged carefully. "We need you on the Iron Throne." Conrad finally turned his head to look at his commander. "Bring the War Council here," Conrad ordered. Vance stared at the simple stone walls and the wooden table. "Here?" Vance asked weakly. "You want to host the Royal Council in a farmhouse?" Conrad narrowed his pale eyes. "I will host them in the barn if I choose to," he replied dangerously. "Set up the command tents in the eastern field." He pointed toward the wide expanse of snow outside the window. "Send a raven to the generals. Tell them the crown rules from this valley until the spring thaw." Vance swallowed his protests and bowed deeply. He turned around and practically ran out the back door. Elise stared at Conrad in quiet disbelief. "You are moving the entire government to my farm," she said. Conrad looked back at her with a calm expression. "I told you I was not leaving," he reminded her. "I meant it." He pulled a heavy wooden chair out from the clean table. He offered her the seat with a slight bow of his head. Elise sat down slowly. The servants immediately placed a plate of hot, fresh bread in front of her. There was thick butter and sweet honey in small ceramic jars. Conrad sat down in the chair right next to her. He did not take the head of the table. He chose to sit at her side as an absolute equal. The brutal warlord had brought his entire world to her doorstep. He refused to drag her into the dangerous, scheming capital. He turned the broken farm into an impenetrable royal fortress instead. Elise picked up a piece of the warm bread. She tasted the sweet honey and closed her eyes. She remembered the watery broth she had forced him to eat just days ago. She had given him her absolute last scrap of food. He was now giving her the resources of an entire kingdom in return. The cold wind battered against the newly reinforced wooden walls. Inside the cottage, the fire burned with a fierce, steady heat. Elise realized the true extent of his dark power. He could destroy an entire town with a single whispered order. Yet, he used all of his terrifying strength to keep her completely safe. She looked at the deadly man sitting quietly beside her. She realized she was falling deeply in love with him. The Shadow Guard moved efficiently through the heavy snow outside. They erected tall iron stakes along the broken wooden fence. They transformed the simple property line into a military barricade. Black banners bearing the silver wolf fluttered violently in the winter wind. The villagers in the valley saw the banners from miles away. No one dared to approach the road leading to the farm. The terrified magistrate was already marching north in heavy iron chains. The remaining local officials locked their doors and prayed for mercy. They understood that the orphan girl was now untouchable. Elise watched the black armored knights patrolling her front yard. They walked with lethal grace through the deep white drifts. She had spent years fearing the heavy footsteps of armed men. Now those heavy boots represented an absolute unbreakable shield. Conrad poured a cup of dark, spiced wine from an iron kettle. He set the warm clay mug gently by her hand. "Drink," he instructed softly. "It will chase the cold from your blood." Elise took a small sip of the rich liquid. The sweet spices warmed her chest immediately. "What happens when the snow melts?" she asked quietly. She stared into the dark red wine in her cup. "Will you go south to fight the rebellion?" Conrad watched the firelight reflect in her dark eyes. He had spent his adult life riding from one bloody battlefield to the next. He had built his brutal reputation on a mountain of fallen enemies. "My generals can win the border war without my sword," Conrad answered. He leaned back in the wooden chair and stretched his long legs. "I have spent 10 years expanding the borders of this kingdom." He looked at the small, sturdy house they sat inside. "I am finished expanding. I only care about protecting what I have already claimed." His intense gaze rested firmly on her face. Elise understood the unspoken meaning behind his heavy words. He had claimed her. He was choosing this quiet life over the endless pursuit of bloody glory. The royal court would call him weak behind his back. His enemies might think the terrifying king had finally grown soft. They would be entirely wrong. He was more dangerous now than he had ever been in his entire life. He finally had a concrete reason to swing his heavy iron sword. He had someone precious to protect. Elise set the warm mug back on the wooden table. She reached out and rested her hand gently on his forearm. The muscles beneath his sleeve were hard as stone. She no longer felt any fear when she touched him. She only felt a profound, grounding peace. Conrad turned his hand over and laced his thick fingers through hers. He held her hand firmly against the wooden table. The storm continued to howl blindly outside the thick glass windows. They sat together in the warmth of the roaring fire. The brutal king and the starving orphan had saved each other. Winter dragged on with relentless freezing winds. The snowdrifts around the stone cottage grew taller than a man. Elise slept soundly beneath heavy furs. She did not hear the faint crunch of boots at the edge of the forest. 50 rebel assassins crept through the dark pine trees. They wore white cloaks to blend into the heavy snow. They believed the king was vulnerable in this remote location. They thought a simple farmhouse was an easy target for a midnight strike. They were completely wrong. Conrad opened his eyes in the pitch-black bedroom. He heard the unnatural silence of the forest birds. He slipped out of the warm bed without making a single sound. He did not put on his heavy armor. He simply picked up his iron sword from the corner of the room. He walked to the front door and stepped out into the freezing night. The shadow guard was already waiting in the yard. They held their weapons in deadly, practiced silence. Conrad raised 2 fingers in the dark. The black knights spread out into the trees like ghosts. Conrad walked directly toward the rebel leader hiding behind a snowdrift. The assassin lunged forward with a poisoned dagger. Conrad stepped aside effortlessly and brought his sword down. The fight was over before it even began. Darkness swallowed the rebel strike force completely. No loud screams pierced the quiet night. There was only the swift, brutal sound of steel meeting snow. Conrad did not let a single drop of blood stain the front porch. He wiped his blade clean on a rebel's white cloak. He returned to the warm cottage before Elise even shifted in her sleep. He climbed back into the bed and pulled her close. She was completely safe. The heavy snow finally began to melt 3 weeks later. The dirt road turned into a river of thick brown mud. A line of luxurious wooden carriages struggled down the ruined path. The royal council had finally arrived from the capital. 10 elderly lords stepped out of the carriages in obvious disgust. They wore expensive silks and heavy gold chains. They held scented handkerchiefs over their noses to block the smell of damp earth. General Vance waited for them on the wooden porch. He looked much harder and leaner than he had in the autumn. He had spent the entire winter chopping wood and carrying water. The head of the council was a wealthy duke named Sterling. Sterling sneered at the patched roof of the barn. "This is an absolute embarrassment," Sterling announced loudly. "The sovereign ruler of the world is living like a feral dog." Vance stared at the Duke with cold, dead eyes. "Speak quietly, Duke Sterling," Vance warned softly. "The king is resting inside." Sterling ignored the warning completely. He marched up the wooden steps and pounded heavily on the front door. The door opened immediately. Conrad stood in the doorway, filling the entire frame. He wore plain black wool and no crown. He looked down at the pompous Duke with absolute indifference. "You are disturbing my peace, Sterling," Conrad said. The lords gathered nervously in the small dirt yard. They realized they were standing in a fully armed military camp. The Shadow Guard watched them from the melting tree line. "We have brought the treaties, Your Grace," Sterling said quickly. He bowed deeply to hide his sudden fear. "We also bring urgent matters of succession." Conrad stepped out onto the porch and crossed his arms. "Speak," he commanded. Sterling cleared his throat nervously. "The Southern Rebellion was crushed last night," the Duke reported. "The remaining lords offer their absolute surrender." Conrad nodded once. He already knew the rebellion was dead. "They offer the hand of Princess Leonora to seal the peace," Sterling continued. The Duke smiled a greasy political smile. "She is a woman of high birth and flawless breeding. A marriage would secure the southern borders permanently." Conrad stared at the Duke for a very long time. The silence stretched until it became physically painful for the lords. Elise stepped out onto the porch behind Conrad. She wore her simple blue wool dress. Her dark hair was tied back with a plain ribbon. She looked at the wealthy lords with calm, steady eyes. Sterling looked at her with blatant contempt. "Your Grace, you must dismiss this peasant distraction," Sterling urged. "A king needs a queen with royal blood. She cannot give you the legacy this empire requires." Conrad did not yell. He did not draw his iron sword. He simply reached out and took Elise by the hand. He pulled her forward until she stood right beside him. He looked out at the nervous council of Welthalen. "I conquered the South 10 years ago," Conrad stated plainly. "I do not need to marry a defeated princess to secure my own land." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold ring. It was the royal signet of the queen. It was a massive blue sapphire set in dark, forged iron. He turned to Elise and held her left hand. He slipped the heavy ring onto her delicate finger. It fit her perfectly. Elise looked down at the royal jewels shining in the morning light. She felt the immense weight of the empire resting on her hand. She looked up into Conrad's steady, devoted eyes. He turned back to the shocked council members. "This is Elise," Conrad declared. His voice echoed like thunder across the quiet valley. "She is the absolute queen of this empire. She rules beside me with equal authority." He pointed a heavy finger directly at Duke Sterling. "If you ever refer to her as a peasant again, I will remove your tongue." Sterling dropped immediately to both knees in the mud. The expensive silk of his trousers was ruined instantly. "Forgive me, my king," Sterling stammered in blind panic. "Forgive me, my queen." The other 9 lords fell to their knees in rapid succession. They bowed their heads into the wet dirt. General Vance drew his sword and knelt formally on the porch. The entire Shadow Guard stepped from the trees and knelt in the snow. 100 lethal warriors bowed to the woman in the blue dress. Elise looked at the sea of kneeling men. These were the men who created the laws that crushed her father. These were the men who built the cruel world she had suffered in. Now they were pressing their faces into the mud at her feet. She stood incredibly tall. She did not hide behind Karan's broad shoulders anymore. "Rise," Elise commanded. Her voice was calm, clear, and perfectly steady. The lords scrambled to their feet awkwardly. They did not dare to look her directly in the eyes. "Leave the treaties on the table inside," Conrad ordered. "Then take your carriages and return to the capital." He dismissed the most powerful men in the country with a wave of his hand. The lords practically ran back to their wooden carriages. They wanted to escape the terrifying pressure of the ruined farm. The carriages rolled away and disappeared down the road. The heavy silence returned to the beautiful valley. The morning sun finally broke through the gray winter clouds. Warm golden light flooded the melting fields. Green shoots of new grass pushed through the wet earth. Spring had officially arrived. Conrad turned to Elise and smiled. It was a real, unguarded smile that reached his pale eyes. "They will write terrible songs about you in the capital," Conrad teased gently. They will say a witch enchanted the brutal king." Elise laughed softly. The sound was bright and clear in the crisp air. "Let them sing," she replied. She looked out over her family's land. The broken fences were completely repaired. The barn was fully rebuilt with strong, fresh oak. The well had a new thick iron chain and a sturdy bucket. The farm was no longer a symbol of her desperate poverty. It was the invincible heart of a massive empire. Conrad wrapped his strong arm around her waist. He pulled her close against his warm chest. "Are you ready to rule the world?" he asked her. Elise leaned her head against his broad shoulder. She looked at the heavy sapphire ring on her finger. She thought about the cold, lonely nights she had spent crying in the dark. She thought about the terrifying man who had chopped her firewood. He had asked for nothing and given her absolutely everything. She had saved his soul, and he had saved her life. "The world is too big," Elise answered softly. She turned her face and pressed a gentle kiss to his scarred jaw. "I only want to rule this farm." Conrad closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of pine and fresh earth. He held his queen tightly in his arms. He knew he would never have to fight a war in the dark again. He had finally found the light. They stood together on the porch as the morning sun climbed higher. The shadows retreated completely from the valley. They were finally home. Sometimes, the greatest power isn't conquering kingdoms. It's finding the one person who makes you want to lay down your sword. That kind of quiet, protective love gets me every time. If this story warmed your heart today, please subscribe to the channel. I always love seeing how far our stories travel, so leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Also, I'm outlining the next story right now, and I really need your help. Should our next hero be a scarred, wandering mercenary, or a cold, untouchable duke? Let me know down below, and I'll see you in the next one.